during the third Tet Offensive battle, and you will describe to us how it went. And I don't want to ask you a specific question about when you saw all the masquerade. What did you see? Who were in that masquerade, and how were they killed?
I guess the first part, how do you feel? It was appalling. I mean, it's just an atrocity. How could anyone look at something like that and go, oh my God, how could other people do that? And again, from my recollection, all you could see were people. So I didn't, how many men, women, children, that sort of thing. We could see they were all facts, but how many, I don't know. How were they all killed? I've seen some that were shot, back of the heads, or just shot. Others that had been had their throats slit. But by the time we got there, unfortunately, a lot of that, the bodies had been in the ground and were still, badly decomposed. When we got to where to see some of that, we helped find the areas and the initial finding of some of these before they were totally covered. I know that some of that's what happened, but
he was a colonel on North Vietnamese, and then he defeated to free war, and then asked him where do you send the troop through the Ho Chi Minh Trail?
Yeah, yeah. And so in those areas, they infiltrated into the south, in the jungle areas where there's not many of us, or the South Vietnamese folks, Army guys, and they infiltrated through that. And they infiltrated into Hue in civilian clothes. They didn't come in all suited up. And so there were thousands that had been able to get in there. But all over the country, that kind of a coordinated effort, that was a, it is. It just go, wow. And the other one, and the honest answer is that the Tet area, it was, for the U.S. side, was a real intelligence failure.
That was one of the things.
Was that one of the questions?
Well, the guy that we talked to yesterday was Bui Tin. He's the guy who took the surrender of Saigon, of the Vietnamese.
Oh, really?
South Vietnamese. Bui Tin said, you guys didn't have really good intelligence. And I'm going, well, yeah.
That's absolutely right. And did we know the Vietnamese were moving there? The answer is yes. From all different sources, and the recon guys and this patrol out here. But the failure was being able to put it all together.
Like McNamara, he gone into, Congress and talk about we need more troops, we need to go send troops to Vietnam. It was 1962, and Tien told us that in 1962 there was a treaty between Chinese and North Vietnam. They said that anytime that Americans send soldiers there, Chinese will involve troop-wise. But after that, 1963, when they won the Korean War, they abandoned that treaty. So if our intelligence was well, we didn't have to worry about going to Vietnam. But on the other hand, McNamara he went to Congress and asking for troops sending there, because they said that if we're not going there, the war we will lose the war. So the intelligence there didn't risk well enough to know that troops going there were more trouble than not having troops there.
Yeah, well, if a lot of them is to say, just like in the Korean War, the reason that a lot of forces weren't used there was the concern that China would be involved. Same thing in Vietnam.
Well, they did get involved in Korea, right?
Yeah, but so because of that, then the thought was, geez, if we go and quote invade North Vietnam or take major actions other than from the aerial bombardment stuff, that maybe that would make the Russians or the Chinese get involved, and then it becomes a bigger mess. And well, okay, those were, again, decisions made well above our pay grade. So in hindsight, even today you could ask that question, and it still isn't a positive. Well, if we'd have done that, would the Chinese really have come in to do that? That's a rhetorical question. Okay. Wake up.
Oh.
You were in Hue, and all the time that the Hue battle was happening. At the time you saw the mass grave, what did you see? And then with your own eye, how do you think those people would kill and who were there?
When we made our some of our patrols outside the city is where the mass graves were found. When we had passed through there to do that, in total the graves were all done. There were some, and we found a number that had been buried literally in their front yard. Because what they did is they had built their I'm trying to think of it. I'm missing a word there. Like the ditches, they're not tunnels, but they're in front of every place to infiltrate in, so they're in the ground. Well, the local people dug those. They were forced to do that. Well, what we found was in some of those had been filled up, and the local people were in them. One of the islands next to the city in Hue, I think it's Goinoi or Island, was an area that they found a mass grave. But the sensing there was one of that was just almost inhumane. I mean, soldiers, we fight and we end up, people die, but it's done, if you will, in a more professional manner. But here they were just innocent civilians, your sensing was just so discredited, because by the time we got there, the remains were not in any good condition whatsoever. And again, that was one of those things that wasn't really talked about. And unfortunately, that was one of the things that I'm sure in the American press wasn't really focused in for the folks back home, because that's terrible. And the news of the day then was, Walter Cronkite saying, well, it's all over and we'd lost the war. Well, for those of us that were in Hue, we sure as hell didn't think we lost anything. Matter of fact, it was just the opposite. But the media did not, in the United States, did not cover that. And that part of that, I think, in hindsight, was just because that wasn't the news in the United States that the media and the politicians wanted people to hear. And that's a very, very sad part of that whole conflict, was things like that. And I don't think certainly was not just isolated in Hue. I mean, we found folks out in the villagers and things over the years.
I still want to get a little detail about that. Who were there? Were they women, children, and?
We could recognize that the folks in there had been women, children, grandparents, older people, because most of the young people, young males, would have been in the service somewhere. But most of those would have been older, really, and some of obviously some of them were children. And they found that a lot of them, again, had been killed, mostly shot. I have read stories. Because I didn't, with my own eyes, sit and see how did that person die. But I know that some had been buried when they were either wounded or not wounded, so buried alive kind of things. But most of them had been shot.
How you and with your troop, feel and reacted to that?
Well, the feeling is again one of more repulsion, just that this can't happen. We don't do that. That isn't the, quote, rules we play under. And so that just, it's just sickening. But there's nothing we can do now. But it gave you the sensing of how, if you will, inhumane the enemy was, and whoever is giving those kind of orders to do that kind of destruction, and then turn around and say it was my fault or it was the Americans' fault for doing this, that's totally unacceptable.
So on the other side of the country in Saigon, there was fighting there during Tet Offensive. And then there was an incident that General Luan, he a two-star general of South Vietnam Army, he pointed a gun and shoot one of the, he closed as civilian, but he actually was a captain, and he did kill 8 of General Luan soldiers, and he shoot that man right in the spot, and then that was followed by Eddie Adams, and then sent back to the state, and the archive, the one you were mentioned about, and the whole press would use that like a big deal about Vietnam War and condemn the war, American as well as South Vietnam, and turn the war into another direction. What do you think about this?
Well, I've of course have read about that, and the thing that in that is a very famous photograph now. Of course, it is almost the photograph of Vietnam. But what you said in the context of why did that happen? That's never talked about. You never read that. And if you put it in context of how he could do that, that was not, if you will, just you said cold-blooded murder. This guy just walks up and shoots some guy. Well, that isn't what it was, but the photograph doesn't tell you that. And so that's an incredibly emotion-evoking photograph. But again, it's another one of if the powers that be said, well, we want to get out of Vietnam, the politics are not good, what a photograph to show that just helps your story along. But I honestly, I didn't see that photo for years later. But it certainly, that's a huge part of the history of Vietnam.
Once again, I'd like to ask you a question that you already answered part of it, was the press coverage about Vietnam War, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and American. Do you think that is reported fairly to all sides?
Well, a lot of my thinking on that, of course, has been tempered by, now it's said to have, can make or break an event. And sadly, I think that particular time in the Tet Offensive was misreported significantly. Again, the ability for the North to take on all of those simultaneous attacks for Tet, well, all of them other than, yeah.
We're rolling.
So did you fought alongside with South Vietnamese Army? What do you think about them?
I've never been in what would be an operation where we operated with the South Vietnamese Army. I've been on some where we had smaller units, a small unit, like a squad, that sort of thing. I did run into some of the South Vietnamese military in Hue. The mayor was an Army Lieutenant Colonel at the time. So we've encountered some of them, but as a real organized combined unit of American and Vietnamese forces, I never had experience with that. And the reputation that the South Vietnamese Army would have varies considerably by your own experience with them. I know that the South Vietnamese that fought in the Citadel, we had none on the south side where we were, but in the Citadel were incredible. And the South Vietnamese Marines is who we would have fought more with, were also just excellent, just excellent. But we didn't have that many combined operations. The Army, or U.S. Army, did much more of that than we did.
So, how do you feel about the outcome of the war?
I think my experience gives me a little different reflection on it because I've been back to Vietnam for a long while and have been pretty active being back there since 1996 was my first visit back. And as we mentioned, I've been back to Vietnam almost 40 times now. So my view of that, I have seen lots of changes, and lots of changes in the economy of the country, but also in their, even the political outlook of allowing and seeing that the freedom of individuals, particularly economically, in business, and that sort of thing, is the way to go. And that, so they've changed that way, but they still are a centralized government. You can hear a lot about the human rights issues in Vietnam, and yes, they do, but I think if we look real hard here at home, we probably have a couple of those. But the one that's most predominant is the religious, human, the relations for in dealing with some of the mountain folks whose their religion is different. They're not Buddhist, so the religion is different, and they also unfortunately make a lot of political speeches and talks and efforts as part of their religion. That's what's against the, quote, the law in Vietnam. So they've taken some harsh measures there. That's true. But you can't, in my view, we can't characterize the entire country because of that one issue. Are they perfect in what they do? Absolutely not. But I don't know anyone else who is either. So in my view, I think we still get some harsh words said about that. I've been to the schools. I've been in I've sat in high school classrooms. The people there are very, very friendly. I don't think that's the people have changed. The government has always been the issue, and I think they're becoming more, as I mentioned, more westernized, if you will. But that was a realization by the government that they want to move into the world economic type areas if they're going to get out of the ancient times, that they're going to do that. And I know they are. I've met a number of the Vietnamese that, you know, I'll say this not typical, but the young men with their MBAs from Stanford University, this business class school, they're back in there, and when their time comes, since we don't hold free elections, when their time comes and the older gentlemen in the Politburo go away, these are the young folks that will get into the government. Will the government change? Will it become a democracy? I doubt it. Do the people really want that? I doubt it. Now, from our perspective, that's how we were raised. That's how we've lived. I've asked them about, you know, well, you have a central government. Don't you want a little more of that? Most are comfortable with that, because it isn't as harsh as it was. And particularly after 75, that was incredibly harsh. They still have a long way to go, but from an American's perspective, we have probably a minimum of 300,000 Americans go to Vietnam every year as tourists. That's a lot of folks. The tourism, as an example, the biggest one is from Japan, second's Chinese, so much so that they don't need visas to go to Vietnam. It's just free entry. We still have to get a visa. English is a second language. And why English? Because English is the language of economics. The US dollar is freely traded in Vietnam. They have a lot of inflation issues there. Okay, so does Greece. So there, there's a lot of areas like that. I see probably downstream that Vietnam is going to be an economically very successful country. And I quite honestly would also say that, well, not necessarily in my lifetime, but I will bet you that we'll have a United States naval facility in Cam Bay someday. And we will operate out of that area just like we have done in the Philippines, Taiwan, and others. And that seems totally out of context, except we also build cars in Germany. And somehow I remember my daddy fighting the Germans and the Japanese. So the time will change. And I think with time, the South Vietnamese who came to our country and now the Vietnamese Americans, your generation, your children, your children's children and things will look at Vietnam very differently because we haven't shared that bad experience. And part of the reason I think I'm reasonably accepted there is because having been in the service, in the military, I have shared some of their bad times, and most appreciate that, they understand that.
So nobody doubt that Vietnam had changed in economic, area, but in political, did you see any big change? And also, Vietnamese communist government now is still very harsh in terms of human rights, in terms of religion, in terms of press, the basic right. Recently, there was a musician, young musician, he composed two songs expressing his love for the country, love for the people, love for the king, and he was arrested and put in prison, and now we still don't know where he is about. So there was still a lot of concern about the political in Vietnam, and enormous of freedom for the basic right. What do you think about that?
Well, again, it is a communist country, and some of the tenets of that style are like that. But all I can speak of is personally. Personally, I've never seen any, religious segregation. I'm not a Catholic, but I've been to many of their churches. I've been to Sunday services. Never any issues there. I have also been to the mountains, and I know there are issues there, but like many, when an American will come through there, we sort of don't talk about it. There are certainly many individual instances where people's basic rights are not acceptable. And one of the biggest ones has been the internet, TV. You can't get all the TV stations. But in the bigger cities, all of a sudden CNN is on TV. So they get a variety of that. And the internet, they can still control a portion of that. Surprise, we do that in the United States too. But so there is a total freedom of information there is not there. It's the government newspapers. And their government, it's a socialist country. So their government is in charge of so many facets of one's life, very different than ours. And I can't say, well, was it right, wrong, or indifferent? It's just not the way we do it. But when I would talk to the Vietnamese there, that living their lives every day, at least the ones we've been in contact, most of them are pretty happy about that. But part of that is they've never experienced, you know, if you will, the freedom of what that really means as an individual. I want to go do something today, I go. I want to go stay at Holiday Inn, I just go do it. I don't have to give you my ID card to go to stay in a place. You go, just because somebody wants to know where you are. I said, that's alien to me. But if that's their practice there, well, we do that. We don't do that here. But there is still a number of what we would term human rights issues in Vietnam that are very alien to us as Americans. Now, we hope, like anything, I would hope that at some point those would change for the positive, and that individuals would have more individual freedom and a less constriction on what they do. So that's a hope.